Hi, I'm Troy Nachtigall. We're here at TU Eindhoven, the technical university here in the Netherlands, where I make generative shoes.
What are generative shoes and why would we even need generative shoes?
Okay, generative shoes are shoes that use algorithms to take the parameters from the personalized information, so we can look at somebody's feet or their social media profile and generate the shoe pieces based upon data. So it's taking data and putting it through an algorithm to generate the structures and the forms and the behaviors of the shoes.
And why would we need that? What can it bring to the table that we cannot do currently with our current system of data gathering?
So what generative design brings to the table is the possibility of personalizing shoes down to the individual movements of the person. We can take the person's data and not only make it perfect for the size of their foot, but also the behavior of their foot. So how they walk, but also what they do in their shoes. So instead of just being shoes for your general movement, we're looking at who are you, what do you do in your average day, do you play tennis, how much do you walk, do you go swimming? I mean, how can we make shoes that really fit your personal behavior?
And what type of measuring systems would you need for that? How would I gather that information from people?
In terms of measuring systems, what we start off with is a footbed sensor scanner. We've built our own, but there's ones by HP and lots of companies are moving into this space. And that'll give us a physiometric data, so data about the person. What we like to do is we like to take that data and combine it with what we're calling sociographic and psychographic data, say from your social media profiles or other sources, that allow us to compile what you do on your average day. And there's companies like Isaac.nl that are bringing that data to us so we can plug that into our algorithms that generate the shoes for us.
And so how does that work from a design perspective? Because then instead of, drawing a shoe and a shape that you think of, what does that look like for a designer? Take me through those steps. I get data and then what?
From a design perspective, it's really fun and interesting because it's no longer that you're designing a specific shoe. And you can design a specific shoe, but you also have to design a form language of shoes. So for example, if we look at the Porsche series of cars, you can look across the entire series of cars and the entire single car over the years, and you can see a form language develop where that car goes and changes slightly year by year by year, but if we were to compress them all into one point, we would have a space that we could move from one form of the car to another form of the car. So the designer for the next age of generative shoes has to be someone that can do a design space instead of an individual object. And you basically create sliders so that the sole can get bigger and smaller, the uppers, the patterns can change in certain directions, but you link those to specific pieces of data. What gets to be fun with that is that you end up using a lot of software that allows you to create these sliders that are happening. So you'll draw something and then you'll draw it another way and you'll morph between the two. And then you start doing series of those things, and at that point the software becomes really interesting because it allows you to put lots of different morphings together and see shoes that you never designed, yet still hold that form language that you designed.
So how would I get that form language into that system? Is that still drawing something, or that is also all based upon data?
Getting that form language into the system is an interesting prospect. It starts with 2D drawing, but you'll find yourself 3D modeling fairly quickly. And you'll find yourself 3D modeling between two things and using animation software to kind of look at the difference between those and making sure that the in-between spaces still look like the brand you're designing for. So you're trying to find those moments where you can have lots of different sliders working and you're seeing the brand from lots of different perspectives at the same time.
And so as a company, if you're trying to get into the generative space, what would you start to teach your designers, let's say first in terms of software, because you're speaking now of animation software, that's definitely not software that they're using now.
Yeah.
It's all about creating still objects, not about moving things, so that's already a very different, thought process for designers to understand. So what would you suggest as a company trying to get into the generative space, how to get that started with their designers?
I think what's interesting about the generative space in terms of getting designers into it is that they have to start looking to software that they don't traditionally use. Rhino, for example, has Grasshopper, which is now built in, that allows you to do lots of crazy, fun, generative spaces, but it doesn't really have an animation suite in it, so you can't really see how those sliders move. Are we working with McNeil to try to talk them into doing this? Yes, but in the meantime, I use Cinema 4D, for example, and other software suites that are typically more used for Hollywood film production that allow us to set a series of parameters. It has its own generative space to it. For making movies like Finding Nemo, we have all those underwater plants that are all moving and shaping and swaying with the water. So you need to have generative software that makes underwater plants. We just take that and apply it to shoes.
Right. So, and how would you suggest to do that? Would you say, well, start teaching your designers to use that software, or will there be other programmers using that software and designers just thinking about what data to enter into the system?
I think it's good for your designers to understand what's happening inside of those visual systems. So I, for example, came from a fashion background, but I went out and took an anatomy course because I wanted to understand the human body better, and that has a lot to do with what I'm doing, is thinking about the bones of the foot and the muscles of the foot, the ligaments, and then the soft tissue that happens on top of that. So what you want to do is you want to get your designers thinking about behavior as well, and how the structures of the foot are built inside of there, and thinking really in 3D. So 3D modeling helps that quite a lot. Secondly, I see a shift in the role of the designers to be a little bit more mathematically driven. They don't have to know a lot of math, but it's not the kind of math that they are typically taught in schools either. We need descriptive geometry and some forms of calculus, but the kinds of calculus that make things beautiful. So it's actually a very visual form of mathematics. And so you get designers into, like, if you go back and teach them geometry again as something that can build the shape of the heel, or how do you define the foot shape in math, and you come up with a formula that makes that mathematics happen, then it becomes really easy for that designer to understand how to change that math and how to make that math fit and shape and find new forms.
So essentially you would say they need to start already in high schools now to do that, or it's almost back to school for designers who currently would like to get into that space.
Yeah, and there's it's a little bit of back to school, but it's finding math that was much more interesting than the math that I was taught in high school. It's finding the forms of mathematics that are artistically driven. So there's a conference called Leonardo, which has a bunch of mathematics professors that make crazy stuff, but it's interesting how you can start to learn how to bend and shape things. One of the things I do with my students here, when I'm getting them to start building systems for me and to become good generative designers, is I basically have them rewrite Illustrator. So they make their own Illustrator. They make a program that can draw points, they can shape Bezier lines, and from once they've understood Bezier lines and they can do their own Bezier lines, they can do almost anything inside of software. Any line that they can draw, they can model.
So essentially that you teach them how to start designing from code? Is that?
Yeah, so what happens is that they learn to code the way they draw. So they learn how to code drawing, and what they'll find very quickly is that their hand and their style of drawing is what they end up coding. Because they're looking at their lines, and I usually have them start by drawing their own line, and then try to find a code that describes that, then drawing a shoe outline, find a code that describes that, and before you know it, you have this mixture of the shape of the foot and the shoe. It goes from 2D to 3D at some point. But you also have their style programmed into those lines. And the differences are subtle, but you'll see it inside of the code when you start looking at the code, that you have just slightly different mathematics, usually the same theory, but its application is far different from designer to designer because they've got their style
so
into
essentially
that.
Your own design DNA can still be literally encoded into that product that you're making, into the process that you've designed.
Yeah, you find your own code that defines you. And then you get to this magic point in personalization where you take the person, you take the foot, you have a shoe that you want to design. This was an early sample. It's not, we're saying it's good. It was just one of the ones we got to happen. But you merge those two together. And so your style of line drawing meets the anthropomorphic figures and ways that foots are made. And so you get these amazing sliders that start happening as you merge the two together.
How much medical knowledge do you think designers will need to have? Because you talk a lot about biomechanics, you have all kinds of biometric data that you feed into the system. Do you consider this system especially good for medical footwear, and what would that mean for designers as well?
I do see that this is good for medical, in the sense that this is what orthopedists and podiatrists dream of having. It's not what I want to do. As a fashion designer, I want to make the interesting, the beautiful shoe. I don't want to make the orthopedic shoe. But what I see happening at the same time is that there's a future problem with diabetes coming, where 25% more people will have diabetes. diabetics need very special shoes for ulcers.
Yeah.
And what happens is that they are driving this innovation.
Yeah.
So I think what's going to happen is that the medical tools are just going to become diffuse so everybody uses them.
Yeah.
So as designers, we should have some medical knowledge. Not a lot. Freshman year course in anatomy, and especially maybe just foot anatomy, is just fine. Sometimes knees and hips get you some interesting things as well.
Yeah.
But enough basic knowledge so that as you're starting to program the data that programs just not the form of the shoe, because programming form is interesting, but where I think generative really has a future is behavior. How does it flex? How do we allow it to flex in certain areas? How does it bend? How does it behave with heel impact? Things that developers would usually do, I think designers can handle if they have a basic understanding of the mathematics behind it. And so I think that what we can get to is with that basic understanding, we can really control how that bend and flex happens and doesn't happen.
Yeah.
So you program not just the form and the surface texture, but you get down into the actual behavior and how it looks through the different parts of the footstep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I see you're holding up your early prototype, one with the green outsole.
Yeah.
I think that, I know this outsole was generated by the software and it was then 3D printed. And that brings me to the area of manufacturing.
Sure.
So what changes do you see in manufacturing when generative design takes off? Because a lot of the things that you talk about now are not able to be done in traditional manufacturing systems.
Yeah. So what I see is there's going to be a shift in manufacturing. We already start to see this with like the Adidas Speed Factory that brings the manufacturing more local, and we find different ways of doing that manufacturing. Or the Desma multi-density soles allow us a much greater opportunity to make something quickly and rapidly in local situ to wherever we find the people. I think what's interesting about that is that we get the greater context of where the people are living as well. So this 3D printing will drive new styles as we start to find designers that are more local to the place that we find them.
So would you say that in the future, the designer that generates the shoe for a specific person, because it's all personalized, will be located in the store, or at least directly in the manufacturing space?
I think they could be certainly beside the manufacturer. As my studio works, we're right next to each other. I have my digital fabrication specialist. Sometimes I run over there and work with them. Then I come back to my design software and I sit there and I work out with my code and my design software what I want to do. And I think that there's something really interesting to that relationship where I can actually have deep conversations with them quickly to get to the next kind of aesthetic that we're looking for. That allows them as material specialists and material scientists to actually work better on what I want instead of trying to interpret some sort of weird drawing with some sort of big enlarged view of what this material might be.
Yeah.
I can actually talk to them directly about, okay, this one no, this one yes, this one maybe.
And so now you're still in the research phase with your project Solemaker. Could you tell us a little bit more about what you're doing and what your end goal is for the PhD research that you're doing here?
Sure. So in Solemaker, I've been researching ultra-personalized product service systems. So what we're doing with Solemaker is opening it up to designers. We've been bringing in people like Eva Klabalova and K Footwear and Vera DuPont and having them bring their shoe designs to us. And we're seeing, can we parameterize this shoe into our system so that we can adapt it to all the different kinds of feet we've seen. In Solemaker, we've built our own foot scanner and we scanned 400 feet with it just to see all the different kinds of feet that are out there. And there are lots of different kinds of feet that are in the world and needed to be accounted for. So we started with a small database to see if we could build upon those parameters from those feet to make other people's shoes. Our system worked, but we built something very close to a Converse shoe, which should be very easy to do. It's getting into those more specific forms of footwear design, finding those outliers that really allow us to build a system that can handle anyone.
Right.
So in building that, what we did is we didn't start with a foot. A lot of orthopedic companies will say, hey, I've got a foot. I'm going to build a shoe to it.
Yeah.
What we wanted to do is take this from a different perspective where we said, hey, I have this design. Can I adapt this to different feet with software? So you can do shoes that are wildly more interesting because then you can start setting parameters that allow us to just get it to work with that foot and the movement of that foot.
Yeah. And so you would essentially also be able to work with designers almost like in a reverse engineering way, where they would bring to you a handcrafted shoe maybe,
Yep.
and then turn that into a system that can be used generatively.
Yeah, we just wrote a paper about how our process looks like reverse engineering, dumpster diving, and a form of studio archaeology.
Yeah.
Because we do take the finished shoe, and then we like to go to people's work and see the samples that got them there, the drawings, the sketches, their process, because actually writing the generative algorithms correctly requires actually interpreting some of that process as code.
Yeah.
So once we understand their process and the samples, and that's kind of the dumpster diving, is going back through their trash can to see everything they threw away to get to that shoe. We can start to say, okay, they like it when we say build a heel cup, but the heel cup is constructed like this. Look at these sketches and how that indicates this, and then we work with the designer to make sure that that's what they actually do. It's very interesting because shoe designers, like many designers, are actually very implicit people. They can't put words to this, so it isn't like I can sit down and ask them to do it. But if I go through their drawings and their process, you can start to see the indications that help you to do that, and you help them learn how to describe it. So in some senses, we are helping designers also learn how to use these generative systems by looking at their process and trying to match it to our system.
So if there are currently designers and companies in the audience, the Footwear Design Summit, watching this, what would you tell them? How can they get hold of you? What would you be open to collaborate on?
Yeah, so hey, everybody out there in the audience, I'm at solemaker.io. We're looking to move into a second phase here soon as my PhD thesis is written in February, where we start integrating other designers into that process to see if we can generate all of these shoes. We've worked with my personal designs and 2 other designers. We're ready to start building that up. We're also interested to look at your manufacturing processes so we can understand how your companies work and how our algorithms might attach to those processes that you already have in place, and how we could modify those eventually. We know that these things don't happen overnight, so we're very interested in looking at how you work, how we can set a direction for that to move into a ultra-personalized age.